A popular discussion among people revolves around video games. Video games have dominated culture for decades, and it is only becoming more realistic and immersive as time goes on. As video game culture evolves, a common pattern arises. Some of the most violent video games are at the top of the charts. This is a concerning revelation to a lot of American people and causes debate between millions of people. The discussion revolves around if violent video games really cause or encourage violent behavior among gamers. Before diving into the topic, one must understand what violence is defined as. Christakis states in a pediatric journal, violence is defined as aggression that has as its goal extreme physical harm such as injury or death. Therefore, it is argued that because of how immersive and realistic new age video games are, that this will lead consumers of video games to become violent. Looking into the statistics of video games will also provide some insight to how this statement can be backed up. In a journal written by Val Gandolfo, it is stated that in 2000, the Federal Trade Commission reported that of the 118 mature-rated video games, 70% were directed to adolescents under the age of 17. This piece of information is concerning. If such violent video games are targeted to young children whose brains have yet to fully develop, then this could cause serious issues. In the same article, it states, children between the ages of 13 and 16 were able to purchase these mature-rated video games approximately 85% of the time. The majority of children do not even need parent permission from stores in order to purchase these M-rated games, which contains explicit content. Games with this rating can contain blood, gore, mutilation, and depictions of death, stronger sexual themes and content, partial nudity, and the use of explicit language. The journal further describes, boys and girls spend 13 and 5 hours a week, respectively, playing video games, almost the equivalent of having a part-time job. Now, understanding the amount of time children are dedicating to these mature-rated games, one must question how this would affect the frequently exposed gamers. But first, let's look at some examples of the M-rated games which are marketed to children. In most video games sold, a common theme is painting a clear good and bad side to the storyline. While this creates an easy-to-understand plot, it can also have negative effect on impressionable youths. This sense of accomplishment with usually killing America's past war enemies in historical games paints other countries as obvious bad guys. This could be a very negative state of thinking for future relations if children grow up with these stigmas. In a popular game that I have even played as a kid, the player is asked to massacre an airport filled with innocent civilians. This game is called Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2. The reason the developers created this scene in the game is to hone in on the No Russian campaign. While this tactic is successful in evoking strong emotion in players, it is also extremely graphic and possibly traumatizing to young children. Mass shootings have plagued this country of late, and making a game where all players partake in this is a very dangerous exposure. In another game called Grand Theft Auto V, a featured interactive torture scene occurs as part of the storyline. Players are given a variety of torture options during this scene, including shocking, ripping teeth out, beating with a wrench, and a variety of other options. Essentially, players are asked to co-author these disturbing violent video games to create their own unique experience. This level of immersion with such violent choices exposes children to much more than any other generation. When looking further into the virtual reality side of gaming, the level of immersion is increased tenfold. In recent studies, VR has demonstrated how it is possible to alter people's behaviors. In therapeutic settings, VR has solved problems such as nicotine addiction and fears like flying. Video games also have a disturbing connection to individuals who have committed terrible crimes. The two school shooters of the Columbine school shooting, Dylan and Eric, were well known for playing the violent and aggressive game Doom. They had spent numerous hours modding the game and reportedly reenacted it during the massacre. Finally, let's look at the evidence of how these violent video games impact children. Video games are seen as having a big impact on young children. Immersive games encourage players to model the behaviors they see on screen. Psychologist and communication researcher L. Rawell Huseman asserts that violent video games are a public health threat because they encourage both short-term and long-term aggression. Because of the over-dramatized plot of video games, many players become desensitized to violent content. After repeated exposure, such violence does not faze children like it should. This dangerous amount of lack of empathy is dangerous and could cause sociopathic tendencies. In order to prove that removing violent video games from children's media diet, Christakis studies children through this process. It states in his article that removing children's violent video games and replacing them with pro-social ones overall decrease aggression and cause improvements in their overall behavior. This short-term study proves how violent video games have such a profound impact on influencing young children. Now moving on to the next section, we dive into the argument of how video games do not encourage violent behaviors. Before we do, however, let's look back on the definition of violence once again. The definition of violence describes that it is aggression that has a goal of causing extreme physical harm such as injury or death. This is a very serious claim to make towards gamers and needs to be debunked. Trump, however, states in a CNN article that, "I'm hearing more and more about people saying that the level of violence on video games is really shaping young people's thoughts." Let's look into some studies now in order to disprove this claim. A 2018 study published in Entertainment Computing tested this theory. This study included 2,778 game players. Most participants played games at least once a week. One group played a game where characters died in a preset animation. Another group played a game with more realistic death animations. Both groups took a word association test after the game. The researchers predicted if realistic games make people more aggressive, they will also cause people to choose more violent words. Yet researchers found no significant differences in word choice. The results suggest realistic violence in games does not shift people's thoughts toward violent ideas. Another study was performed 2 years earlier from an economic study published in February 2016. The researchers of the study looked at violent criminal offenses in the weeks after the release of a popular video game. When tracking both sales and crime rates, it was found that general societal violence decreased in the weeks after the appearance of a new edition of a popular video game. This evidence suggests that video games have the capability to keep violent individuals occupied and off the streets. This means video games can even keep citizens safer. Let's look at one more study that took place in the Netherlands. This study provides a longitude follow-up which combats the argument that violent video games do prime children for violence. In this experiment, 194 children from the Netherlands were surveyed for their overall gaming habits or exposure to violent video games, as well as multiple mental health-related outcomes, including aggressiveness. During this first assessment, children were only 9 years old and had a follow-up assessment the following year. The results showed that exposure to violent video games at age 9 was not predictive of aggression or reduced pro-social behavior 1 year later. This violent gaming did not cause aggression, but showed to be only slightly related to increased mood symptoms, like depression and anxiety, but the relationship was very small. Looking into some final statements on the topic of violent video games, some red flags seem to rise. First of which is just calling video games violent. Doing this does not hold much conceptual value. In doing this, its value seems to be mainly emotional, convincing the audience to loathe the games before data is even presented. If this logic is also pointed at other forms of entertainment, then literary novels such as the Bible, comic books, Shakespeare, Harry Potter, and many others could also be blamed for violent behavior in individuals. This violent video games is such a broad term, and it can include almost every game imaginable, from Pac-Man through Oregon Trail and right up to Grand Theft Auto 5 and beyond. If one game gets blamed for violence, then every game could be criticized for it as well. With this type of thinking, the masses could be led to believe that video games should be taken away entirely, which is a dangerous outlook. Overall, video games are not the thing creating violent children, but rather predisposed violent children only gravitate towards these types of games. In conclusion, video games do not cause violence in the youth. The correlation between violent individuals and video games is only that those people choose these games because of their predisposition. These violent games do not make them this way. Video games could even have a positive influence on youth by being a form of catharsis for them. If an individual could take out anger by playing particular video games, then this could be a form of therapy. Video games, as talked about previously, also keep individuals occupied and off the streets as well as out of trouble. Finally, most studies conducted over the effect of violent video games on youth are very short-term and do not hold much reliability. Long-term studies such as the one on Netherlands youths shows over a year-long study that portrays no side effects of frequent gaming with violent video games, other than a small correlation between gaming and anxiety and depression. Overall, video games should not be blamed for corrupting people, and more action should be taken to treat mental illness as a whole for individuals.